Hello and welcome back to Count Her In. We are super excited and honored to have Tiffany on the podcast today. Tiffany's message really spoke to Ali and I, and we were so excited when she replied that she could be on this podcast. Tiffany is the CEO and founder of Diversability, and we're so excited to talk about everything entrepreneurship today with you. How are you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
Doing good. Ate a lot of good Asian food, so feeling really happy. Happy tummy, happy mind, body. I don't know. There's a saying with that.
Was that Aristotle or no? What about you, Tiffany? What's going on?
I am joining you from San Francisco. We've got, unfortunately, the fires up north in Tahoe coming in. You've got your pollution and we've got fires, but it's okay right now here in San Francisco. I know we were chatting a little bit earlier about the COVID situation. Unfortunately, not getting better here in San Francisco, as I'm sure also many other parts of the country, as we have these natural disasters just ravaging all parts of our country right now. In Louisiana, thinking about everyone who was affected by Hurricane Ida. So just taking things a day at a time.
Yeah, I was also going to mention, Weilyn and I were calling 24 hours ago and she casually mentioned, oh, by the way, I'm in a hurricane or tornado right now. So I was like, oh okay. Yeah, so I think
it was super bad. I think UPenn and a couple schools in New York, they closed today because nobody could get to work. So definitely feeling fortunate that I'm safe here, my family's safe, but definitely wishing all the best to families who were affected by like the semi-tornado that happened yesterday, just the really bad storm. Yeah, but kind of moving from the bad weather talk, we would love to start this podcast with asking you, what are you bringing to the table today, both literally and figuratively?
Yeah, well, I was like looking around as you asked me to bring something to the table literally. Actually, I have a little bit left, and it's kind of like blurred as I show it to the screen, but I have a little bit of a sore throat, which I'm waiting for my COVID test results, so we shall see. But I've been drinking hot water and with lemon and honey and ginger. I don't know if anyone else grew up with that concoction.
Yes. My goodness, I have it like right now. I always get like sneezing in the morning, but like immediately cold, hot water, ginger, lemon.
So good. So I do. So I actually, about a year and a half ago, I spent a little bit after New Year's coming into 2020, I went to Cambodia and I ended up buying this ginger lemon tea. So all I need to do is put in honey. It was so smart.
That's amazing.
So that's what I got: ginger lemon tea with some honey in it. And then figuratively, what I'm bringing to the table is, I don't know. Yeah, I don't even know where to start with that question. I'm bringing to the table being the first generation daughter of a Taiwanese immigrant and a refugee from the Vietnam War. My dad passed away when I was 9 in a car accident that I was also in, which has inspired and influenced a lot of the work that I do today. But I think what I bring with me and continue to wear on my sleeve is, kind of this like lifelong journey of not only like unlearning a lot of harmful messages about how I viewed my own body and how other people viewed my disabled body as well, but also kind of like lifelong healing through grief and trauma and things that I would never wish onto a 9-year-old child.
That is, first of all, thank you so much for sharing. I know things like this are not easy to share and they come with a lot of baggage. And although I'm sure you've said and told this to people, the words still hold such gravity. So I just want to say on behalf of Weilyn and I, we really appreciate you sharing that with us. I completely agree in that even though you did not directly live through the experience, there's definitely like passed down experiences and passed down traumas in many senses, which of course can be negative in many ways, but there are also ways that it can be positive and values that can be taught through that. Like, for example, my grandparents, they were in the Holocaust, and my parents, they weren't exactly, but there were values that were passed down to them, and even passed down so much show. And I think everyone feels that in some ways, always like the immigrant mindset in some ways, which is quite cool. But yeah, I just wanted to think about that in that respect. Weilyn, what are you bringing to the table today?
Yeah, for sure. Again, kind of echoing what Ali said, like I'm so excited for this conversation today. It's kind of a space that Ali and I haven't really touched upon on the podcast, but it's such an important one. So definitely looking forward to exploring your entrepreneurial journey, but also like the messaging behind everything that you do. I think today I really hope to bring to the table like a good listening ear. I think that on the podcast, sometimes, you know, the focus is on talking and kind of bringing your own experiences to the table. But I think today I really want to be a good listener, whether it's in this podcast, but also to friends as they begin to start school. And then literally, kind of on a lighter note, I have been super dehydrated on campus for some reason. So I went ahead and I got myself like this huge, massive jug. Oh, it's not going to show with the green screen, but it's like a really big 3-liter jug. So I'm excited to stay hydrated. What about you, Ali? What are you bringing to the table today?
Awesome. So I always start off my days with just a big jug of water. I don't drink all this is 5 liters, but I just drink a lot in the mornings. But last night, I don't know why. Do you guys know those like big not sushi, big seaweed things that are meant for sushi? Like
like nori sheets?
Oh yeah, I must have had like a dozen at least. Like it's so many. Like they're just like you just munch on them. It's like paper. It's nothing. But then going back to dehydration, they're super salty. So now I'm like drinking so much water. But yeah, that's what I'm bringing physically, literally to the table.
I just remembered I brought something else to the table, which is
God.
I've just been gifted a boba plushie, and I'm in my 30s, and this just like brings me so much joy. So I didn't even realize it. It's kind of my like you know how some people have cats and stuff as emotional support animals. I've got a boba plushie.
I love that.
Pillow. I love that. You'll get it like its own seat on the plane, that sort of thing. I love it.
Why was that me when I was little? I would like purposely like during the flights, I would like take my penguins out. Like my penguins are my favorite animal. I would like take them out of my bag and I would be like, they need to breathe. They need to like see the window. And I'd like prop them up. I'd be like, oh my goodness, we're on a flight. Those really good days before college.
They never end. Because also I think what I like is just the facial expression on the boba plushie. And my friend who gave it to me, we had to like put it in the trunk to like go eat. And so then we like opened the trunk and the first thing you saw was just like the boba plushie, like lying on its side, smiling.
Oh my god, that's so cute.
For sure. Never in a bad mood, I guess. So it was reliable. That's awesome. That's awesome. So to get us started, Tiffany, I'm so curious to hear about how you kind of started your entrepreneurial journey. And I don't mean necessarily like when you signed those incorporation posters or when you were the one to open a bank account. Like when, as Weilyn says, like when do you think you saw those first like inklings of entrepreneurship? Were you younger, like maybe starting your own like little lemonade stand or selling something at school? Or were you doing like a creative art project that like no, like the teacher said like this is it, but you were like outside the box? Like where do you think those like first inklings of entrepreneurship or entrepreneurial energy really started?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I mean, I think the earliest thing I can remember is I had drawn a flyer that I was willing to do my siblings' laundry. And I think it was like, if you want wash, dry, and fold, it's $5. If you just want the wash, if you just want the dry. And so, you know, part of my story that I've shared in other places is that after my dad passed away, my mom worked really, really hard, which also meant that she was never home. And so you had 4 semi-young from 9 to 14-year-old kids at home, kind of just learning how to fend for ourselves. And laundry was kind of like the thing that I had to like learn how to do. No one took advantage. None of my siblings took advantage of it though, but I still have the flyer somewhere. I took a permanent marker. I still even remember, you know, those pens, and you'd get them in like packs of 12 of like every single color. So I like had all the colors on there, and then I took a permanent marker and I drew an arrow. Pretty much it was like half of the flyer page. Like that was a direction to my room. Like, hey, you want to go book this? Like head over here to my room. So no one took advantage of that, but I want to fast forward until 2013. At this particular point in time, I was still working in the corporate world. My background is in finance. So I was working on Wall Street at the time, but I had started to see a couple other friends venture into entrepreneurship. And as I mentioned earlier, my dad is from Taiwan, and my connection is to Princeton is I met Princeton's Taiwanese club as a freshman at Georgetown,
Oh,
and they actually
amazing.
inspired me and one of my friends at the time, Jackie, to start Georgetown's Taiwanese club. And I'm actually still in touch with a lot of Princeton TASA, as we call it. So I bring up TASA and the Taiwanese club because I wanted to create, and this is a fundraiser / entrepreneurship. I wanted to create a necklace that was the shape of Taiwan. And in the US, here, a lot of people will wear necklaces that are the shape of their state, like state pride, like a really beautiful, either like sterling silver outline. And when I looked online, I didn't see anything like that of Taiwan. So I ended up finding, like Googling like jewelry designer, New York, Googling like 15 of them. One of them actually came back to me. Her name's Shannon Shang, and she was actually Taiwanese and really resonated with what I was trying to do. So we launched that as a fundraiser for ITASA, which is kind of like the intercollegiate connector of all of the college Taiwanese clubs, and we did it as a fundraiser for them. But those were the early days of Tiffany's foray into entrepreneurship. And interestingly enough, like even if I look at the work I do now, like I feel like I kind of just came into it accidentally. I don't think I ever set out to be like, this is going to be the thing that I do and people are going to see me as an entrepreneur. I think that I'm actually still growing into that title or that label.
For sure. I think one of the things Ali and I definitely talk a lot about on this podcast is redefining what entrepreneurship looks like. So you mentioned that you're kind of like growing into this role, but we love to say to all of our guests, like, you are already an entrepreneur, and like obviously like you're still growing and learning more, but I think we often associate entrepreneurship with like a very strict defined, like this is specifically an entrepreneur, and usually it's a white cis male living in California, Silicon Valley, starting a tech company, but it doesn't have to look that way. And so that's kind of something that we definitely emphasize on this podcast, and I'm sure a lot of our audience knows that. I actually would like to pivot slightly and talk a little bit about your experience as an Asian American in Georgetown. Last semester, I had the opportunity to take an Asian American history class, and learning about the opportunities for Asian Americans, both here at Princeton, but also other colleges, kind of was a little disheartening, to be honest. There's not a lot of like classes and courses that are available. So I'd love to hear like just a little bit more about your experience, whether you took any classes about like the Asian American experience.
Yeah, such a great question. I will say I grew up in Maryland, suburbia, in a city called Bethesda, Maryland. It's about 20 minutes outside of DC, or 20 minutes away from Georgetown.
Like 5 of my closest friends here are like all from Maryland for some odd reason, and I have to go down and see it sometime.
Oh, I love it. Yeah. So, but I also want to highlight that the high school I went to was called Whitman, and informally it was known as White Man. And to be totally transparent, it actually wasn't until this year that I really confronted my race and the fact that I actually have erased or diminished my race in a lot of my work. I talk a lot about, intersectional disability representation and intersectional disability activism. But I use my platform to highlight Black and Brown voices, and I never realized that I was kind of missing from that conversation when we talk about people of color as well. So when I went to Georgetown, there was a level of familiarity there, which was I just came from a high school that people call white man, and now I'm at a college that has a religious affiliation to it that may or may not be the dominant one within Asian communities, Jesuit. But while I was there, you could even call the creation of the Taiwanese club in 2006 for me an entrepreneurial venture. But I actually didn't grow up speaking my mother tongue either. So Georgetown is not only where I learned and minored in Mandarin, That's actually not really my mother's tongue. I guess my mother's tongue would really be Cantonese, and then my father tongue would actually be Taiwanese, but then the common one between the two of them is Mandarin, or the business one.
I feel that.
So I didn't grow up speaking any of them, right? And so actually going to Georgetown was the first time I had really connected with my Asian roots. At the time, that's when the Virginia Tech shooting had happened, and when a lot of us were really, I think I was a senior when that had or maybe a sophomore when that happened. Yeah, 2007. And that's actually when I first started to really understand what cross-Asian solidarity looked like, at least at Georgetown. I think there were 17 Asian clubs, or maybe, I feel like I'm like not 17, maybe like at least 10. There were a lot, and we called ourselves Collaboration. Jackie and I had started the Taiwanese American Club. I was learning Mandarin. I studied abroad in China. And then actually I ended up getting a certificate in Asian studies from the School of Foreign Service there. So I will say that I actually feel like I got what's the word? Like, I feel like I really embodied that exploration of what it meant to be Asian American during that time. And I'm actually really grateful for Georgetown for so many different reasons. But one of the biggest is that you are in a container or a safe space where you can really start to explore some of these things and explore your own identity in the context of this broader world that we live in. But then after I graduated, it's so I majored in finance and accounting, and then I minored in Chinese and got the certificate in Asian studies. So it was always like the dominant one was kind of like the finance side of things. And so when I moved into the post-graduation world, quote unquote, real life, as some people would call it, I didn't really have that many opportunities to really have, whether it was academic conversations or informal conversations with my Asian peers about that experience, because it was so like focused on the finance side of things, and who's recruiting for what hedge fund and what's the next step for you and other things like that. And so it's actually only until this year, and actually I think I'm in touch with some of your classmates, Weilyn, who are creating the Asian American with Disabilities initiative. They just hosted a really great event. And what I'm learning after this year of everything that happened with Stop Asian Hate and the rise in anti-Asian violence is how we really need to talk about this intersection more between what it means to be Asian American and disabled. And there's a quote that happened during this event that they hosted from someone named Mia Ives Rubley, who's another disabled Asian that I really admire. And she said, "We can never be the model minority because we're disabled." And I think like many of us know already that the model minority is a myth, but like we are actually we are an example of the living embodiment of why it is a myth.
Mm-hmm. No, I really resonate with that message. And I really love the work that, so one of my good friends, Jen, she works with like setting up the Asian American with Disabilities kind of like campaign, but also club and initiative. And I think it's so important. There's so much to unpack with the model minority. I read a book recently called The Model Minority Paradox, I believe, or the Asian American Paradox, talking about how, like from more of a sociology standpoint, how it is a myth and like the reasons, and breaking down why it's a myth, why it's not just, like Asian parents value education more, why it's not like, oh, like Asian people are just like naturally smarter, and really debunking those common myths that we hear. So no, I think we could go into a whole nother podcast talking about this and the intersectionality between them. But I would love to hear more about your work at Diversability. How to get started? How did you kind of pivot your career away from like the finance industry into founding your own startup?
Yeah. So I started Diversability while I was at Georgetown. So again, another reason why I'm very grateful for my experience at Georgetown. And it was really, the seedlings of it came from starting this Taiwanese American club as a freshman. And then as a senior, I said, well, as a freshman, I already saw how it's done. So I'm really curious what it would look like if I did it again, but for a disability identity. And the reason why I started it was because I grew up really believing that my disability was so shameful that I shouldn't tell anyone about it, that I should hide it from the world, and that something was broken and that I would need to be fixed. And really the aspiration for me was to be quote unquote normal, which I wasn't in this disabled body. And because of that, I felt really isolated in my experience. And as a senior at Georgetown, now with my Goldman Sachs full-time offer in hand, I became really curious about what it would look like if I could find other people to talk about how isolating this experience is. And one thing I often say is that I wanted to create a space where disability is the reason to belong, not a reason to exclude. And so that's actually when Diversability was created. I kind of informally called us like a meetup group for disabled people to share our stories with each other. But we also wanted to invite our non-disabled allies to the table to exactly like you said, Ali, earlier, to break bread with us, to really get to intimately understand what our experiences were like. I ended up applying to something at Georgetown called the Reimagine Georgetown Grant. And we won enough money to just get our launch event started. And after doing a couple of those, then it was time for me to graduate. I left Diversability behind, went forward onto Wall Street. And it wasn't until about 2014, at the end of 2014, again, I hadn't really been involved in Diversability. I had left it at Georgetown, and it was just a student club. And I started getting a lot of emails, or I got an email and a Twitter and a tweet from two people I had never met before, asking what was going on with Diversability, or saying that they had come across like a school article, like a school paper article about Diversability, and that they had their own lived experiences with disabilities and wanted to really appreciated the platform that I had created to help share our stories. And what it made me realize, and so this is like 2009 until 2014, about a 5-year gap. What that made me realize was when I originally started Diversability, it was because I felt so isolated in my experience. And in 2014, in this decision to kind of have it be rebirthed and then incorporated into a business, was this idea that I couldn't really find any cross disability movements. One of my arms is paralyzed, and I didn't realize that there was a group for the people with the paralyzed arms, or I couldn't find them. Now I know there is a group for us, which is also very helpful in its own ways. But I just found that the disability community was so fragmented because I wasn't a wheelchair user or had visible aids or visible markers of my disability that you could see straight away. I didn't know where I fit within the community. So that was kind of number one, was how could we create a cross disability movement? But then number two, it was how can we bring allies into the conversation? Because so many of the conversations we're having within the disability community are existing kind of within a vacuum, within an echo chamber, saying, I had this experience, and the other person said, oh, I have this experience too. And that creates access intimacy, right? Because you have two disabled people talking about this shared experience of oppression or exclusion or having to adapt or having to be resilient. But Emily Ladau, who is another disability advocate I really admire, says that in order for us to build a more accessible world, we actually need to make our disability experiences more accessible to the people who don't share those experiences. So again, how can we all disabled and non-disabled kind of come together to share those experiences together? And then finally, I think a lot of us talk about awareness movements. Those are fine, but I kind of just wanted to take it to the next level. Like, we're aware that disabilities exist, but can we be aware? But like, what's the next level of being aware? Because I went around for 12 years after becoming disabled, being aware that I was disabled, but having no like self-actualization in my disability identity, because people were telling me to feel shame about something that I had no control over, and the way that my body, the way that things had happened to my body. So this third bullet was kind of like, I just really want to explore what disability pride means. What does disability empowerment mean? What does it actually look like to have a disability culture and a disability community where there is art and music and incredible things happening because of our disability identity? So circa 2014, those were kind of the things that were running through my mind, which are, I don't see anything that kind of sits at the intersection of these three things. let me put it out there and see if anyone is interested. So I'm sure you've had other guests on the podcast before who their ventures or their companies started out as side hustles, which is what Diversability started out as. Again, I saw us as kind of like a meetup group. You know, I'm still working in my finance job during the day, and at night I'm hosting these meetups. And it wasn't until about a couple months in where the New York Public Library reached out to Diversability and said, can we hire you and pay you to, you know, provide a couple disabled panelists on this librarian awareness training session. And that was the first time that I realized that there was value in this community. And I know that this question will come later, but one of the things that I just want people to be reminded of, whether or not you are disabled or not, is that you have inherent value and worth at 100% just because you exist. And I think that so much of our external messaging, at least as a disabled person, is telling us that we are at 40% because people are just devaluing who we are and what we can contribute to society, again, just because of something with our body and our mind and the way that it operates. So that was a long story, but ultimately was what I had realized was that we had created a market. People were willing to pay us for something that I hadn't realized up until that point could be monetized. And that was actually the beginning of really thinking more seriously about, wow, like I needed that New York Public Library thing to happen for me to actually learn and then go out and educate others that there is value and worth in this community that should have an economic, you know, return to it. So I've been full-time on Diversability for 4.5 years now, but that transition though, last thing I'll say, that transition came because I got a job to move out here to San Francisco. And about 6 months into that job, I actually ended up getting fired. And I think that many of us who are Asian, even though we know that the model minority is a myth, some of us still ascribe to some ideals of it. And when I got fired, I really felt like a failure. And I told myself, I'm going to do this Diversability thing in between. I'm not going to tell anyone I got fired. I'm going to say it was a mutual thing. And going to do this Diversability thing in the interim until I found my next job. And now 4.5 years later, it's still my thing. I haven't found my next job yet.
Wow, there are so many things I feel like we can unpack and talk about there. But there's one thing in particular that I really resonated with towards the end, which was when you talked about how the New York Times Library, like, thank God it happened. And I love this idea, like everything happening for a reason, like every single thing. I was just listening to a podcast with Laurie Santos, who hosts this podcast called The Happiness Lab. She's a professor at Yale, and she interviews just every myriad of people you can imagine on her podcast. But some of the people she talks about is happiness, like how do you have happiness, are people who have been in like tragic car accidents, that sort of thing. And only those experiences that they think about after. I'm so happy that happened. That allowed me to appreciate the smaller things. I'm so much happier afterwards. I was so obsessed with that next job or that pay raise, getting another comma in my net worth, that sort of thing. And it was like the moment that like I lost feeling in my leg or something we would see in society is objectively tragic, allowed them in their mind and their body and their impact and who they are as a person just elevate and become so just in touch with who they are in many ways, which is, I think, quite beautiful. So yeah, what are your thoughts on like everything happening for a reason? Do you see those inklings still coming up, or anything recently, like your job now that allowed you to work full-time in disability, which I think is fantastic, but anything else you would say that you can attribute any successes or happinesses in your life due to that mindset of everything happening for a reason?
I have taken Laurie's course, available on Coursera. I would highly recommend it, The Science of Wellbeing. I think it's easy to say in retrospect that everything happens for a reason. When you're in it, it really sucks, So for anyone listening, if you have watched or listened to any of my other content, like so much of what I'm about is really just acknowledging the ebbs and flows of life. Sometimes when I watch videos of myself recount the car accident, I cry. I think it's so unfathomable what happened to a 9-year-old girl. I'm baffled that she is me, you know? And the word I use is awe. There is a stat out there that says about 10% of people who experience trauma, and 10% is pretty low, will experience something called post-traumatic growth. So with post-traumatic growth, you get a new appreciation for life. These may be the people who Lori is having on her podcast. But that still means there's 90% of people who are still actively healing through their trauma. And I'm sure it may be very difficult for them to look at the situation that they're in when you're in your lowest of lows and say that everything happens for a reason. So I would improv you and yes, and that statement, because I think in retrospect, I, again, would not want what happened to me to happen to anyone. And it wasn't even just the car accident. It was really those years that followed of, if you've seen one of my TED Talks, I talk about chronic exclusion, that experience of being chronically excluded every single day, not only in my home environment of being super isolated, but also in a school environment, pretty much like a whole world kind of like in this continuous cycle. And I've been doing a lot of work now. That's why when we opened by saying, what are you bringing to the table? I talk about how I'm still healing. You know, I don't think I've overcome anything, like triggers still come back. But I also have what some people will call selective amnesia related to the events that happened after the car accident. And so sometimes when I'm on these podcasts, people are like, how did you cope when you were 9? And I was like, I don't remember, right? But you just have to. And then people were like, what were you like as a middle schooler? I was like, I don't remember. Because yeah, it's almost like when your environment is so hard, the way that your body and your mind is trying to cope with it is by saying, we don't want you to revisit those places because it was too difficult in that time and it's too difficult now. So I feel like that took a little bit of a dark angle, but I think that's super. I just think like, and I've been seeing so much happening now around the intersection of being Asian and mental health and access to care, that I spent so long, I think, trying to be the strong person who overcame so much that ultimately it ended up backfiring on me. And now, 24 years after the car accident, I'm now doing the work that I need to do that I wish I had asked for, or wish that I knew I could ask for, I had access to even 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago.
Yeah, for sure. I think that there's so many things that I want to touch upon from what you said, but I definitely agree. And I'm honestly in so much, not awe, I don't know whether awe is the right word to use, but just a lot of respect for the work that you're doing. And yeah, like awe and like inspired by the work that you're doing, truly, because I think oftentimes when we talk about disabilities, I didn't know that only 10% of people experience post-traumatic growth. And like you hear sometimes like the influential speakers, they're talking about how they grew from their experience, but those are not necessarily true for the general population. So I really respect all of the honesty that you give to this podcast. I want to hear more about how Diversability is opening up conversations with allies, because as an Asian, I know that in Asia, like honestly, disabilities are pretty taboo. How do you think that Diversability is opening those conversations to have more comfortable and inclusive conversations with allies?
Yeah, such a great question. So I will start by saying, first, I want to talk about ableism. And ableism is the idea that in its simplest form is when people and society deem a person valuable and or worthy based on their body and or mind. And so the body and or mind is the type of disability, and the value and worth, right? And you'll hear these themes of me talking about value and worth a lot. And so ableism, again, is this idea that we place some people more valuable and worthy because they don't have disabilities. And if those are the messages that I'm receiving as a kid who is now newly disabled, then I absorb those messages. And if I don't have a place to kind of like complete the cycle of like washing that messaging out of my body, it gets stuck. So I absorb these messages that I'm not valuable and worthy. And one of the things that I have learned recently is part of what fuels what we call internalized ableism. So it's ableist beliefs that those of us who do have disabilities hold, whether it's mental health conditions and chronic health conditions, which you can't see, which so many more people have than you would know. What ends up happening is the way we unlearn our own internalized ableism and the way we unlearn ableism is by creating spaces to talk about it. Because you're not creating spaces to talk about it, what it's doing is it's festering ableism. It's saying this is so taboo, so stigmatized, so shameful to talk about, we're not even gonna talk about it. And ultimately the shame ends up becoming bigger, right? And so for me in this, because at a fundamental level, Diversability, even as if you look at us as a company, what we're doing is we're just hosting and facilitating conversations. But what I think we try to do is first, we want to become visible to each other. So we as disabled people need to find each other, which is what I did as a student in college, creating Diversability for the first time. I need to meet other disabled people so that I know I'm not isolated in my experience. Then as a function of meeting them, I realized, hey, here are all the things that made me feel shame about the way my body was, or made me feel victimized in my experience, or the way people made me feel like just because I was disabled was such a tragedy. The car accident, yes, tragic, yes, tragedy. Being disabled, no. How can we detach the two from each other? Which I know is kind of confusing because it's like how I became disabled is sad, but the fact that I am disabled is not sad. So we become visible to each other, which then this comes to the ally part. So first we need to become visible to each other. Now that we're in our little sphere being like, okay, here are all the things I want to reword about how I'm talking about my disability experience, because the way I talk about my own disability experience gives other people permission to talk about my experience that way too, or gives other people permission to enter the conversation on that same level of energy. So once we've been able to kind of like, again, I call this like the self-actualization of being disabled and proud. Once you reach that period of that self-actualization, and that's this first point, we become visible to each other, then we can become visible to other people. Then we come out and we say, okay, Tiffany, this is why I talk a lot about healing. I've gone ahead and I've done the work, and I know that I'm continuing to heal through my trauma and grief related to that accident, but I have learned how to adapt my body in so many different ways that this is, and oftentimes I tell people, a disabled body would not exist if it wasn't supposed to exist, right? So the fact that we put so much shame on a disabled body, similar to the way, you know, we have shamed people of color, we have shamed women, like, I don't know, and this may be a little radical, like we wouldn't exist on this earth if we weren't supposed to be here. And again, if we weren't 100, we didn't start at a baseline of 100% value and worth. And then society then throws all these messages at us that make us feel like, oh, maybe let me reconsider. And then it's like a video game where then you're like losing points and then your percentage goes down. But I just went off on a little tangent there. So, but the whole idea is once we've self-actualized as people who are disabled and proud, then we can go out to our non-disabled allies and model, here is how we want you to talk about us. And maybe not even talk about us, talk with us. We're not this foreign object that is scary and shameful. And, you know, I read a book called Daring Greatly in 2016. It's by Brené Brown. Actually, she's actually just announced she has a new book coming out in a couple months. And I was like, I need to like read all of her other books again. And then, but what she talks about shame festers when it is in secrecy, silence, and judgment, that trifecta, secrecy, silence, and judgment. And so I became super fascinated. Where are the areas in my life that I feel silent about because there's shame? Where are the areas of my life that I'm judging because I feel shame, or that I am that are secret because I feel shame? So I didn't tell anyone, maybe you already know this, I didn't tell anyone about the car accident for 12 years. So from 1997 until this is why I have like that selective amnesia, because I couldn't even go around and tell people what happened, you know, like, and again, like if I think back, and I love these words you're using, like awe-inspiring and stuff, and like post-traumatic growth. If I go back, I'm like, how horrendous is it that we couldn't let a girl from 9 years old until 17 tell anyone what had happened? she couldn't tell anyone that because now I'm like meeting up with friends from high school and they're like, Tiffany, I knew about your arm, but it's not because you were forthcoming about it. We just saw it, but we never said anything about it. Again, the silence, right? And then they're like, we never knew about the car accident. And these are people I hung out with every single day, you know? So that was, again, a long answer to a complex question. Family dynamics, very complex. You know, when I wear a splint on my arm now for like wrist stabilization. And my mom's like, why do you wear that splint now? Because 24 years ago, I wore the splint. And now I wear a splint and it has cool artwork on it. But even when I went home, I was like, am I going to wear my splint or am I not going to wear my splint? Because in the context of how I operate within my family unit, there is still massive amounts of shame toward my disabled body. And I want to respect that that is the family that I came from as well, right? And so a lot of my entrepreneur story is about learning that, again, when I said earlier, and when it was Mia who said it, when Mia said that we can never be the model minority, I also had to learn that in the context of my family, my disabled body was always going to be a point of shame to them. But how could I detach how they feel about that from how I feel about myself?
So powerful. It's so powerful. I'm definitely sensing some future Brene Brown inspirational, motivational speeches from you to come. We'll go back and watch your TED Talks.
Yeah, let's manifest, like, I don't know, some Brene Brown, Tiffany Yu collab.
Yes, for sure.
No, as we begin to wrap up the podcast, we'd love to ask you our iconic question at this point, which is, what do you hope to leave on the table? And by that, we mean, what sort of legacy or lessons would you say to your, honestly, maybe even your 9-year-old self that you seem to be, that you talk about sometimes, but even future entrepreneurs? So what sort of lessons and legacy do you hope to leave?
You know, I had a totally different answer to this, and now I want to change it. So the original answer was, which I have repeated multiple times in this podcast, is I would love to leave your listeners with them knowing that just because they exist, they have inherent value and worth. I think that's just like a consistent theme. But the other thing I wanted to say was, over the past couple of years, I've really redefined what success means to me. And success to me is that I like myself. Sometimes I get asked on podcasts, you know, what's your greatest achievement? Or, you know, you've got a Wikipedia page, which accomplishment is your favorite? And I'm just like, I like myself. It took me a really long time to get to a point where I feel like I am showing up in the world as the full embodiment of myself. And I hope that I can leave your listeners with just knowing that I hope that you can continue to be on a journey of looking at yourself in the mirror and really assessing, take all of the external accolades out of the picture, continue to do the work on yourself. When you look in the mirror, do you like what you see, and do you like yourself?
That's amazing. And thank you for sharing your authentic self with us today. I think I have a lot to think about, and I think a lot of our audience will have a lot to reflect on, especially around our conversations. If they want to continue to follow your journey and Diversability's journey, how and where can they do that?
Yeah, so you can find Diversability at DIVERSABILITY. Maybe you'll put that in the show notes because it's not a real word. And then if you want to follow me, I am at I'm Tiffany Yu. That's just 2 letters in the front, the letter I, the letter M, followed by my first and last name.
Amazing. Thank you so much for coming on Count Her In. We are so excited to see what the future has in store for you.
Thank you.
That wraps it up for today's podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. We hope you learned a lot about Tiffany and take some time to reflect on the conversation of today's podcast.
Check out our past episodes and look out for our upcoming episodes featuring inspiring female entrepreneurs through Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this podcast now.
To stay updated and involved, join the Entrepreneurs Network community on our Instagram and LinkedIn, and get in touch with us to share your very own entrepreneurial journey.